Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Hearer, are there not those in the world for whom sadness, pain, anger, and even confusion are involuntary and not under the control of those who they happen?
I suppose there are. Why do you ask?
The Buddha has never mentioned them.
I would not be so sure, Hermit. The Buddha does speak at length about them, but not in the way you might think.
How does he speak about them? What does he say?
He argues that all the myriad illnesses, afflictions, sensations, impingements, hindrances, and experiences are essentially one, and that there is one medicine for them all, the Dharma.
I wonder where the nearest pharmacy is. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing the issue of Buddhism and mental health. What is the Buddhist perspective on mental health? What does Buddhist scripture say about it? How does that perspective change over time? We hope you enjoy. So, first question, what is the Buddhist perspective on mental health?
We should start by defining our terminology in as much detail as we possibly can. I personally think of the phrase mental health as referring to the emotions, feelings, experiences, and behavior patterns and thought patterns that are a result of neurochemistry, behavior, lifestyle, and in the worst cases, trauma. This is all based on a Western scientific perspective on the relationship between the mind, the brain, and consciousness. There is the idea that thought patterns, perceptions, behavior patterns, etc. all have to do with neuronal networks and pathways in the brain, their constituent neurotransmitters, and the behaviors and stimuli that activate them. Thus, from this perspective, mental illness is when any of these processes unfolds in a way that causes distress for the person in their daily life. The Western scientific understanding of the relationship between the mind, the brain, and consciousness draws entirely on René Descartes and his idea that the mind possesses the body. There is the idea that I am a mind, but I have a body, rather than perhaps being a body and having a mind. The mind is the center of awareness. The mind is the center of thinking and feeling and sensations. And you can think of the mind as the driver and the body as the car. It has all of its physical processes that kind of go on independently of the mental processes. This is not entirely true, but this is called Cartesian dualism. This is a very popular trend in Western philosophy. Recent mental health research, neurological research, and all of our everyday lived experiences show that the relationship between body and mind is a lot more complicated than that. But this is the approach that psychology and biology started from in the early modern era. In talking about the Buddhist perspective of mental illness, let me start by saying that this is not at all how Buddhist scripture understands the mind, the brain, consciousness, emotions, or anything like that. Thus, Buddhists in the past have taken a different perspective on mental illness than Western medical sciences have. We'll talk about them and their scriptural perspective in a second, but modern Buddhists also take an approach on this issue. Western medical sciences and methods have spread all over the world, and so most modern self-identifying Buddhists, except probably monks and nuns, share the Western medical perspective, because that's just how the world works nowadays.
So, what does Buddhist scripture say about mental illness?
Let's start by saying that I personally think that Buddhist scripture has a problem here. The law of karma is often applied in this case. Your current life, with its disabilities, strengths, weaknesses, afflictions, liberations, etc., are all a direct causal result of your karmic past. According to the karma model, if you are a person who is neurodivergent, or if you suffer from any mental illness or disability of any kind, it's because you did something morally bad in the past. And whatever suffering you're going through now is your karmic retribution. This is textbook victim blaming. There's no room in this model for the involuntary symptoms of mental illness. They did not have any way to understand that mental illness is often a result of neurochemical imbalances that the afflicted person has no control over, past, present, or future. The model of the mind and the emotions that is at work in this understanding is contrary to Cartesian dualism. Remember that the Buddhist understanding of personhood is encompassed by the teaching of the 5 skandhas, or the 5 aggregates. The things that make us up are physicality, sensationality, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. The way that all of these are related is pretty complicated, but I'll try to explain it a little bit here. When physicality and sensation are combined, or when they meet, that is perception. Whenever the eye and what is seen by the eye meet each other, you have sight, the perception of sight. When consciousness and perception meet, mental formations occur. So our consciousness hijacks our perception and files it away in some categorical, discursive, discriminatory way. Discriminatory, of course, in the sense of this is this and not that. When mental formations occur, they inform consciousness. Whenever you file these things away, then your consciousness has data one way or the other that this is not that, or that that is this, or what have you. So what does that all mean? It means that consciousness determines perception and mental formation, and also vice versa. But consciousness and mental formation are karmic activities. That means that according to this model, you can determine your conscious experience by taking hold of the karmic reins of your life. It means that if you cultivate the Eightfold Path, your consciousness and your mental formations will all improve considerably. In that way, the Buddha way is the medicine for mental illness, even if the Buddha way argues that your mental illness is your fault. So the Buddhists claim. If we take this perspective for a moment, I believe that in many cases of mental illness, if a person cultivates the belief that they can change, cultivates healthy goals, and cultivates healthy means of achieving those goals, all from the perspective of supporting, loving, and forgiving themselves, they can actually achieve stable wellness. However, I recognize that this requires a baseline amount of resources, and does not apply to all cases of mental illness. Western medicine acknowledges that there are people who are not in control of their experiences, and Buddhist scripture does not acknowledge that.
So once again, as we said with the episode on gender issues, it's disappointing, but this is also a spot where I would say that Buddhism is not alone in this problem.
Exactly. If we pick another religion, then it is some deity being angry at you and making your life bad because you've done something bad. It's all sort of punishment by the universe. And it's understandable. That's just a very 2,500 plus years old understanding of why bad things happen. It's a very preliminary one that doesn't have a lot of nuance and isn't really supported by a lot of evidence, but is easy for categorizing everything bad that happens.
It also makes the universe make more sense if there's an explanation. Like if you can attach an actual concrete cause to these random aspects of life, it makes the universe make more sense. So I think it is maybe not a good thing to look for. This desire to make these random aspects of life make sense is understandable at the very least, because if with all of the work in describing the world that any religion does, but especially Buddhism, I would say that there are much more complex arguments in many cases with Buddhist philosophies, and being that complicated, it would seem, I think, perhaps strange and inconsistent if there was not an explanation for these acts. So you get this idea of karmic balance where, my back injury is because I did something bad in a past life or whatever. And that sucks. I don't like the implication that this back injury is my fault somehow, especially my fault when I wasn't me.
Exactly. That's the thing, is that there is an inherent contradiction in this scriptural explanation. I should start by saying that in a lot of the sutras, there's always, especially the Mahayana sutras, there's this part near the end, typically. This is a very regular, normal thing to see. It says that if you don't uphold this sutra, if you don't teach it, if you don't copy it, if you don't recite it, then you will be reborn in this hell realm, or you'll have disfigurements and bad breath and bad health and be very ugly and all of this stuff. This is super, super, super common. And I think that at a guess, it wouldn't be a bad assumption to make that those parts of the sutra were not spoken by Siddhartha Gautama himself, if in fact he existed. I have a lot of complicated reasons for thinking that, but the most important one is that the sutras that we have are at least two, the earliest sutras we have are at least 2 centuries removed from the alleged life of Siddhartha Gautama. That means that the Buddha did not write anything down. The Buddha's first generation of disciples did not write anything down. And the Buddha's second generation of disciples did not write anything down. So the earliest sutras we have are so far removed that by the time that the teaching, the Dharma, Buddhism, the community, or the Sangha as it's called, started writing these things down, it was very large, and it was already starting to attract attention from opposing fields like the Brahmanical tradition. And so you start to see the inclusion of all of these parts that start to sound kind of not Buddhist, where they say, like, if you don't do this, it's bad karma. But it's just about that teaching. It's about kind of like proselytizing in its own way. So I think that those are not genuine words of the Buddha, but at the same time, they are in all sutras or nearly all sutras, and a lot of people believe in them. So it's still important and still relevant nonetheless to our discussion.
So let's talk a bit about how the Buddhist perspective on mental health changes over time.
This will be a small preview to next week's episode. As you all know, Western medicine has taken up meditation and mindfulness practices as treatment for different mental illnesses. Indeed, there's constant neurological research in the fields of psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience about the benefits of meditation for mental health. I don't think this is a bad thing in itself. I think this is a good way to go back over some of this problematic scripture. I think that it is a way to offer nuance to what used to just be a very simple and, I don't want to say primitive to take away the agency of people in the past, but certainly a very not nuanced way of explaining the universe. Meditation and mindfulness have been very helpful for a lot of people over the years, and I don't think that any of that should stop. However, I do think that it is important to note that the meditation that therapists and counselors have us do is typically not the same as Buddhist meditation. It's not wrong, it shouldn't stop, it helps a lot of people, but be wary if they claim that it is Buddhist, because it's actually not. Indeed, the meditation that self-help communities talk about and push on people is a Western interpretation of Buddhist meditation. And there are actually many, many Buddhist meditation methods and practices, and they all have their own doctrine, their own procedure, their own results, and their own debates in the scripture, their own purpose. What Westerners call Buddhist meditation is oftentimes an essentialist view of Buddhist practice. Essentialism is kind of like reductionism. It's where you take something super complicated with a lot of traditions and a lot of contradictions and a lot of debates, and you simplify it and only emphasize the essential parts of it for the ease of understanding. In addition to that, this oversimplification is often highly ideologically charged. The Western essentialization of Buddhist practice is charged with Orientalist perspectives, or this idea that the East has some magical philosophies that are very esoteric and very mystical and will help you in some magic way. And it's all very charged with that. It's also very charged with a Western philosophical and scientific perspective and interpretation of these different Buddhist scriptures. And that comes out in the translation issues that we've seen. Another thing that fuels these translation issues is the East-West power structures that we see in the modern era. There's absolutely a historical component to what's going on here. Because in the early modern era, starting, let's say, 150 years ago, the West was rising in power and dominance and beginning to engage in imperialism, then you start to see these problematic interpretations of what's going on in East Asia at the time that Westerners arrive. The reason that this is a problem is that it's an example of the field of science co-opting their own misunderstanding, their own essentialist perspective of Buddhism to offer more validity to their own belief system, their own, I guess you could say, data sets. So These are all issues that we've discussed in our Buddhist modernism episode, and we'll be discussing them a little more in the next episode about Buddhism and science. But the short version is that science and Buddhism have a long-lasting relationship where they both reach to each other for validity and credibility. And we should be careful about living in between that relationship, because what we will get is often not good science or true-to-life Buddhism. What's even more interesting is that because of the East-West power structures that we've talked about, Buddhist communities, like I said, are looking to Western medicine and its research on meditation as though it offers scientific factuality and validity to the Buddhist doctrines. They use this research to argue that they figured it all out 2,500 years before the scientists ever did. So this is all tied up in this back and forth relationship that we've talked about. And join us next week and we'll talk a lot more about it.
I want to go back to this conflation of Buddhist meditation and the type of meditation that comes up in therapy. So I have firsthand experience with both systems, and they're not very similar. The type of meditation that comes up in therapy and mental health contexts does not look very much like Buddhist meditation. In fact, I enjoy Buddhist meditation, but cannot stand the therapy style of meditation. It just does not work for me at all. So I would say that the thing to keep in mind is that they both use the word meditation, but they have different methods, they have different goals, they have different formats. I'm to a point where I'm not sure that meditation is the correct word in the therapy sense anymore.
I would agree completely. Agree completely, because meditation, as we understand it, we typically think of it as the mind contemplating itself, or the mind and body contemplating the mind and body, this sort of like meta-analysis of self. And oftentimes I think that therapy meditation takes the form of some way of like focusing on something in the real world as a means of calming the mind, or getting every part of it pointed in the same direction. Whereas before it might have been scattered and not really focused well and stuff. And in fact, in some of the scriptures, you'll find that that's kind of all the things you're supposed to do before you start Buddhist meditation. As we remember from the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, you're supposed to overcome anxiety and slothfulness and distrust and the 5 hindrances that we spoke of before you even start. And there's a very strict prescribed method to that form of meditation. And meditation in Buddhism changes over time. Like I said, there's tons and tons of traditions that you'll find. And in fact, the practice of meditation becomes such an intense practical tradition that oftentimes people who would like to join a temple, they would go there and they would be rejected from joining that temple on the grounds that their constitution, their health is not strong enough. So if you are sickly in any way, if you're super, super, super thin and you have low appetite, or if you have bad joints and you can't sit for very long, or if you have any of these other issues, oftentimes they will not let you train in this kind of meditation because it's very hard on the body. It's very hard on the mind. And in fact, the purpose of it is to break you in some way. Their idea is that you have some delusion of self, and they're trying to get you away from that. They're trying to give you ego death in a way that doesn't revolve around things like psychedelic drugs. You actually have to mentally work yourself up to ego death. And oftentimes that's just very difficult and it's very taxing. There's a fantastic book that I'll include in the show notes called Eat, Sleep, Sit. It's about an American's experience in a Zen Buddhist temple. And that's quite literally what they did. Eat, sleep, sit for 8 hours, 10 hours a day. And their whole purpose was to be contemplating these very complicated topics that oftentimes would give them anxiety attacks. In fact, Zen sickness is a very well-documented issue where someone has like a nervous breakdown because they're contemplating things that are so contrary to psychologically what the brain is instinctually pointed at all times. the brain is very instinctually pointed at, I have a self and I have to preserve and replicate that self. And Zen Buddhist meditation in particular is just going directly against that. And it can cause a lot of turmoil and a lot of distress in people who maybe bite off more than they can chew by engaging in it. But I'm interested to hear from you what the methods that you experienced in therapy for meditation were, because I have my own experiences and I can share those, but I'm interested in what you have to compare it to Buddhist meditation with.
So the big difference between the two, I would say, is essentially the goals. Because the two versions of meditation have such different goals, everything else about them changes.
Mm-hmm.
In therapy, my meditation exercises were usually a lot more about finding mental quiet, about focusing yourself and just slowing down your mind a little bit. Whereas often in Buddhist practices, the mind seems to be speeding up, if anything. You're contemplating things actively. You're checking what kind of sensations you're experiencing. You're very engaged. And in my experience, at least, the therapist style of meditation was less engaging. It was much more about slowing down.
I would agree with that. I've had similar experiences. And if I use an analogy or a metaphor like the mind is a car, therapy meditation tries to slow down or even stop the car, whereas Buddhist meditation has a specific place to drive the car, as opposed to wherever you might go with it in therapy.
Yeah.
And I think that as a means of getting maneuverability, getting control of the car, slowing down to start with is an important part. You have to slow down and get your bearings. You have to know where you're going. You have to get all four wheels pointed in the same direction. And that's what we see in the beginning of the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, is there's preparation involved. And that level of preparation is consistent through almost all meditation traditions, including all the way up to Zen meditation. But the preparation takes on a different form in Zen as opposed to in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta or in other things like that. But you're exactly right that there is an active engagement of the mind with something. You're trying to contemplate a concept or a koan or a nonsense phrase. You're trying to visualize a Buddha or visualize something that you've never seen before. You're trying to scan the body and experience the experiences of the body in a very amplified and mindful way, or what have you. There's plenty of these traditions. And sometimes meditation for Buddhists doesn't mean sit and put your hands together and do something with your mind. Sometimes they'll conflate it with a ritual action. So reciting or chanting a sutra, or doing some sort of ritual behavior, or even like later Buddhists come to think of like sweeping the temple as a meditation practice, or just anything becomes a meditation practice. Writing poetry becomes a meditation practice, and doing these active things with a real product as opposed to sitting and doing something. All of these are ways that meditation changes over time in Buddhism. And Western therapeutic meditation and mindfulness, it doesn't really give justice to all of that.
And it's because they're different tools, essentially.
Absolutely.
Like you said, I think that your analogy of therapeutic meditation being slowing the car down and Buddhist meditation being taking the car to a specific place, I think that is a really good explanation for it, because it also explains why I bounced off of therapeutic meditation when I tried it. I don't have a hard time slowing down. I have that control already. My problem is figuring out where to go. And so that is why I think the therapeutic style meditation didn't work for me, because I already had the product it was offering. Whereas the Buddhist style meditation works for me because it is helping me develop something I lack.
That makes perfect sense. And I have seen similar things. I think that there are times where therapy, meditation, and mindfulness comes quite close to the threshold of Buddhist meditation, whether it's on purpose or not, but it kind of stops short. I'm thinking of times where, especially for people who suffer from anxiety or panic, one of the prescribed mindfulness techniques is to list to yourself these experiences, like these sensations you're feeling, things you can see, things you can smell, trying to get you out of a spiraling or recursive thought cycle and plug you back into your senses and get you into a more external setting mentally. And that's very close. That's very close. Yeah. We see in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, there's a lot of contemplation of feeling as feeling, of smell as smell, of sight as sight, whatever. Very, very close. But as we've said, the purpose of one is to break up a thought pattern and just get you to be like okay and not distressed for a moment. And the other one is to come to some greater understanding of something profound and very specific for the Buddhist soteriological path, the Buddhist path to enlightenment. There's an ideology and an agenda to Buddhist meditation that I don't really see in therapy meditation.
Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of Buddhism and mental health. Next week, we'll talk about the relationship between Buddhism and Western science. What is that relationship? Do they believe the same things? Do they reinforce or validate one another? Join us next week to find out. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Our email is bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com.
You can find us on Twitter @BrightBuddhism.
As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.